Okay, so this is the second video that I've produced on the topic of VZ2008s and VZ58s and the many issues they may have over their lifespan, or even, and more commonly, initially, things that will cause serious hiccups in their performance and how to resolve them, whether it's, send the parts to me or do-it-yourselfers. I'll help as much as I can, as long as I have the time to do it. Alright, first issue, bent pistons. Remove the dust cover, and what you're going to look for is you look for a wobble as you spin it. Also, you're feeling for it binding in the in its cradle here, okay? And if you're still not sure, remove it, place it on a really flat surface, and you take a caliper and you use the depth gauge on a caliper, and as you rotate the piston, find a dimension and see if it stays constant, okay? Now there might be some variance due to the table, so that's why you want to get as flat a surface as possible, but that'll tell you if you have a bent piston or not. Something to note, I generally suggest that people replace the pistons with the OEM hard chromed pistons. They seem to be more durable. I've definitely seen pistons bend under strain, and I've never seen any of the stock ones do that. But the new product, I've definitely seen them fail. All right. I've seen bent, crushed, or worn springs, so that's something to look for. Your brand new rifle may come with one of those, so keep that in mind. Next thing we're going to talk about is canted front sights. Many VZs have a canted front sight. If you notice, this one has been pressed. It's a little hard to see. You can see it sticking out just right there. It's been pressed quite a ways to the left. That's because it's canted to the right, and they had to press it to the left. If yours is canted too much, either replace the barrel or push these pins out, press the sight out, index it, press it back on, and then drill ever so slightly larger holes with appropriate new pins to press in. Okay. Next issue, I've seen safeties where they really like to get kind of lodged right there. Now this gun has no oil in it whatsoever. It's never been fired. So that's one reason why it doesn't want to flip. But you want your safety to flip very smoothly back and forth, okay, with very little resistance. You want it to lock up real good, but once it's sliding, you don't want it to find itself like that. The gun won't work and does you no good, okay? So one of the things you can do to help that situation, you're going to take some time and patience, and you're going to polish the high spots on the safety here and the groove where it mates here with the sear, okay? Do not be aggressive. You'll find yourself needing a new safety. But polishing these points helps it function with the 3- or 4-pronged leaf spring inside. And I'll show you that now. This is the 3- or 4-pronged leaf spring. And speaking of, I do not recommend that people mess with it. You want as much resistance as you can get, basically speaking, to keep the sear up, so it guarantees that it catches the striker as the striker slides over it. It's going to keep this pin in place, and it also takes care of the safety. So it does a lot of stuff. You don't ever want to get it near heat, and if you should decide to remove the 4th spring right there, you don't want to do it with like a Sawzall or an angle grinder. It's going to heat up the spring, reduce its life, and or possibly cause the rifle not to function properly anymore. So maybe a hacksaw or some dikes, and then just wiggle it back and forth till it breaks. But I don't suggest that you put any measurable amount of heat into the spring, okay? Otherwise it could be crap, and you got to buy yourself a new spring. Okay. This is not an issue. The next topic, But it's a helpful hint. This has a fixed stock, but for those of you who have a folding stock that want to remove it, replace it with something else, try putting a little bit of heat into the screw that's holding into place. Do not heat up where the folding stock mounts. Don't heat the leading edge of it. Try and put as little heat into the folding stock as possible, because you can very likely virtually ruin it, because it's under a lot of stress. It's a cast piece, and there's a lot of there's a lot of pushing and pulling in there. And when you put heat to it, it actually relaxes, and you may find that the stock gets really hard to fold at certain points, or it's really hard to open it up again, and maybe the lock won't even work that well anymore if you put too much heat into it. So focus all the heat on the screw. It doesn't need to be red hot. Just wait. You'll see some of the oil, the residual oil, start to cook off, maybe a little bit of smoke, and you're done. Put a large flathead screwdriver to it, and the screw will come right out. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about head spacing. I own a lot of these rifles, and this rifle was the first one to have any head spacing issues. I did notice that the barrel, and you want it, by the way, generally speaking, to sit flush with this surface here, but this barrel was sitting proud, so a little too far into the receiver, and lost my train of thought. And I was hand cycling rounds through it, and sure enough, one round didn't want to close. The gun didn't want to go into battery. So here's your bolt carrier, and literally that's as far as it would close on this one particular round. Well, I took that round to my other rifles, and sure enough, they all closed up 100%. And that made me think that the round was just ever so slightly out of the projected tolerances for that cartridge, right? But would you rather the rifle fire and be safe, be fully in battery, or would you rather it fire while the locking lugs aren't completely locked up? That sounds catastrophic and really scary to me. So I did try head spacing gauges. What is a good to go and no go gauge, or go and no go? And honestly, they weren't very helpful. These rifles tend to have a very large chamber, and so those gauges just seem to float in there. I think what might be more useful would be a field gauge. And field gauges, I think, are designed to factor in for a mild amount of dirt and debris, and that probably would have worked well. But so what I did was I built a jig, and I drilled out the pin that's right here, the barrel set pin, and I pushed the barrel out, pressed it back in, and pushed it out till I got it just right. And then I drilled a slightly larger hole with using the original hole, but I drilled it out and pressed a larger pin in. Okay. One thing you want to keep in mind is don't be aggressive. If you've got this under a drill press, I suggest you use gravity to drill through it. I've heard of people using as little as 10 pounds of pressure and having the drill brick bind and break off inside there, and it's going to be a nightmare getting that thing out, and it's going to be costly. So literally just gravity. If it needs to take you half an hour to drill a little tiny hole, let it take half an hour. Okay? Trust me. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about the leading edge of the bolt and how that can affect how it goes into battery. All right. So we're looking here. This is the leading edge of the bolt. Okay, and this is the extractor. I've seen where this extractor is sitting too proud, or rather, it's too tall. Okay, what you want to do is remove it. Okay? And you do that by pressing real hard down on it and slowly shimmying it back and forth till it pops out of there. Okay, and when you want to put it back in it again, you want to hold the spring and the detent pin. You want to hold that down with like a probe and slowly work the extractor back in. Okay, and what I did with this one, for example, because this one was sitting too tall, I just filed it down. Okay, You don't have to worry about rehardening it because filing is removing material without generating any heat. So the hardness of the steel remains. Okay? It might give you a shiny surface that might be less resistant to corrosion, for example. I've never found it to be an issue, but it's still, you're cold forging it, you're not softening the steel. So this thing's going to extract thousands of rounds, no issue. All right. If this had remained too long, it was actually resisting. See, it was actually resisting the locking lugs here from going where they belong, going into battery. Okay, because it was so tall that it was actually trying to keep the bolt back here instead of letting it go into battery. So that's an issue that you might look into. All right. Next, we're going to talk about the underside of the bolt. Okay, I've actually polished this because this rides. It rides, or I should say, grinds on the cartridges. You know, if you look at yours, my guess is the surface is about 200 or 300 grit sandpaper. So think how that's gonna affect the function of the gun as it rides over the bullets. What if you're hand cycling them, and then you want to reload them? Not reload them. Put them back in the magazine and hand cycle them again. Maybe you're just testing the function of the gun. Well, you'll notice that you're scoring the cartridges. Now, what if you were reloading? It's actually damaging the casing. So if you had brass in there, you're going to be causing severe damage. You're going to be weakening the wall of that cartridge if you don't polish the underside of the bolt here. Okay? All right. I have heard, though I have not experienced, bent firing pins. Should be very obvious. The pin should freely fall, come out, you'll see it, you rotate it, it falls back in. You should be able to hear it. If it doesn't do that easily, it's bent, replace it. It comes out by removing the extractor. Next, we're going to talk about strikers. I've seen lots of strikers, and twice now I have seen ones with cracks radiating right out of here. Okay, the ones that have a little section removed all seem to be fine, but let's say half of the strikers I've seen have a hole drilled in here, and 2 of those had cracks radiating out. I think that's a catastrophic failure in the works. Make sure you check your strikers. If you don't want to mess with it, don't want to think about it, replace it with a striker that looks like this with no hole here. Okay, but if you do have a hole, just check it every time you clean it. And I think that should probably be fine. Alright, next we'll talk about why there are so many issues with VZ2008s. I have found with a caliper and measuring from different points that these receivers are actually just ever so slightly more shallow than other manufacturers' receivers. And you'll notice that as the bolt carrier slides back and forth, that it may go like clang or bang or clunk, 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 clunk as it's bumping into things as it moves through its process of chambering a new round. You'll notice it mostly when you're hand cycling it. I have news for you that the other manufacturers, their bolt carriers don't do that because they don't actually connect with anything else inside the rifle. They're not supposed to connect with other parts of the rifle except for the disconnector, and we're working our way through this. Okay, so that's why you may be having so many issues. And every little thing that you do to the rifle to improve it, the things that I list, you resolve those issues, you'll find that the rifle just becomes amazing, absolutely amazing. All right. Moving on, we're going to talk about the ejector. Okay, that's this little guy right there. Okay, and let it focus-ish. All right. See how if you divide it lengthwise in half, the leading edge, half of it is flat and the other half is at like a 30-degree angle. Okay, if you don't have that, So right there, the leading edge. Okay, if you don't have that, recreate that. Take a file and drag it across here and here. Okay, until you're able to recreate that. Obviously, don't take off too much material, but you want half of the leading edge to be flat, straight down, and the other portion straight down to be at about a 30-degree angle. Okay, that helps it reliably, and it helps it to be reliable as far as ejecting cartridges, and it keeps it strong. Okay, if you have, and I've seen it many different ways, if you have one that just has a cutting edge, so there's no flat portion and then the angle, the cutting edge, it'll look kind of like one half of a pair of shears. Okay, that will cause really weak ejection. Okay, because it doesn't have that blunt impact where it shocks the cartridge up and out of the rifle. Okay, so you want to take that sharp edge off and blunt it, obviously retaining this angle. If you don't have this angle here, it will cause the cartridges to eject more often than not straight up. And what will happen is that the bolt carrier may actually catch the cartridge as it goes back into battery and prevent the firearm from firing again. Okay, it can also just cause the hot cartridges to rain down on top of you. All right, that little 30-degree angle makes it so that the cartridges are flung out to the side. Okay. Also, the ejector may be, because the receivers are so shallow, it may be too tall, and you will notice this when you take the bolt and you slide it through here. It should not connect with anything. Okay, but if you feel it banging into the ejector, then it's too tall and it needs to be trimmed down. File or a Dremel, that type of thing, should take care of that. Okay, moving on. There are 4 reasons. I hope I have that right. 4 reasons why you may be having a trigger reset issue. Obviously, the gremlin, which is resolved by tabbing the carrier. Okay. There is the issue of the Century disconnectors. This is the disconnector right here. I'll show you that. This is the disconnector. Okay. And if you notice, this one's tall and round. Okay. The Century ones will be shorter and often with a notch cut out of them. Okay. Now it may work with your rifle, but if it doesn't work with your rifle, replace the disconnector, okay? Because if the disconnector can't get pushed down, if it's not tall enough and it can't get pushed down far enough, it won't release the sear. The sear won't be released, and it won't pop back up to catch the striker, and you'll have a dead trigger, okay? That's reason number 2. Reason number 3, and I think I have a trigger around here somewhere that I can demonstrate with. Reason number 3, and there's no spring in here right now, but there's a spring that sits in here. If this spring is bent, crushed, or weak, the reset will be weak. This has to move. It has to return to its natural position for that reset to work. Okay? So if that spring's weak, it may not return it in time or at all, and you'll have a dead trigger. So think about replacing that spring if that's your issue. All right? And then the final reason, the sear, which is this guy right here, it may be too tall. And I'm not talking about where it mates with the striker as the striker slides over it, okay? I'm talking about the underside. And if you've already replaced the disconnector and the spring and you're still having issues, you want a nice solid click every time the trigger is being returned to its natural position. Okay, if it's a weak click, then you've got an issue, and it may be that this sear isn't the proper shape. Okay, and you can actually send it to me along with some of the other internal parts, and I will machine it so that it works every time. One way to test to see if you're having a problem, and this, by the way, does not check if you have a gremlin. Gremlin happens in the field. Okay, so do not use this test for that. You're going to hand cycle it, and what you're testing for is non-gremlin reset issues, okay, because the gremlin is related to reset issues. All right, you pull the trigger, the striker falls forward, great. Now what you're going to do is you're going to depress the trigger and hold it, okay? Just keep holding it. Now, slide the bolt carrier back all the way, return it to its in-battery position, and you want that striker to not follow it forward. If the striker's following it forward, even if you have the tab, like I said, it's unrelated to the gremlin, then you have to look at that little spring in the trigger group, the disconnector, and how tall the sear is, okay? The sear, it gets a little more technical. You're probably going to want to send it to someone like myself. I'll take care of it for you, return it, and you'll be good to go. All right. Another issue. Hope you guys aren't bored yet. Another issue. These are cross pins here and here, and it's going to look like there's various cross pin configurations, but they have two different shapes. There's one, and they have different. There's obviously different notches and whatnot. But this is a basic cross pin here. So just try and replace the one. If you see a picture on a catalog on the internet, order that one, and you should get that one. But they do have slightly different configurations, and it's not necessarily specific, but sometimes it is to the position they hold in the receiver. Sometimes it's universal, and literally the same pin works for both spots. Okay, but you may have a bent or scored one, in which case replace it immediately. All right, and it might be real obvious, or it might not be. You can actually put it in a drill chuck from this side, and just instead of putting a drill bit in, you put this in the drill. And you just hold on to the end here, spin it, and you may observe a wobble. If you observe a wobble, throw it out and get another one. Obviously, make sure it's the right one that's going in there. Let's see here. All right. So, moving on, I have found that some magazines, and, I don't even know if they're still making magazines, but some magazines, there is a bit of variance in the thickness of the aluminum, and certainly, depending on how many times it's been painted, it may actually bind in the mag well, okay? Whether there's a variance in the aluminum or there's just too much paint there. And what you can do to take care of that, get yourself a real nice file, and what you're going to do, and obviously it's the flat surface here, it's a half round. You're going to drag it right across this surface here and remove the high spots. Okay, yeah, it'll make the magazine ugly, but would you rather have a magazine that works or one that's ugly? That doesn't make any sense. Would you rather have a magazine that works? Wait, I guess that did make sense. Anyhow, all right. So drag it across this surface here, and you only need to do this if it's binding, but it'll be pretty obvious if it's binds, because when you insert it in the magazine, it may rock right into place, and you're like, oh, that's great. Locks up real solid. But then when you depress the magazine release, you're like, and it comes out, All right, it should just drop free. All right. And what you can do, you can actually remove some material here. Okay. And meanwhile, you want to maintain the magazine and file how they relate. You want to maintain that. You don't want to catch it at weird angles as you're doing this. And finally, I've found that sometimes this area back here needs to be removed. Right here. Not this, not the part of the locking mechanism, but right here. And if you were to file it, you're actually going to damage the follower right there. So what you do is you take your fingers, you make sort of like a chimpanzee hand, and you press the follower down so you can't hit it with the file, and then you drag the file straight across there. Obviously getting your fingers out of the way. Right across there. Okay? Okay, so now I'm going to show you some of the upgrades that I've done to the rifle. I have bronzed the front sight. Okay, it is half the diameter or less of the stock steel sight, but it lights up. So, in front of a bright surface, it's going to function exactly the same, only be more narrow, so it'll help you with those 200 and 300 yard shots. But in front of a darker surface, it lights up. See? You can't do that with the steel ones. Okay, you could paint them, but that paint's just going to burn off when the barrel gets hot. Okay, but the bronze isn't going to go anywhere. All right. So same in front of a light surface. If like you're out in the snow or very light sort of desert setting. But as it starts to get darker during the day, that front sight's going to get harder and harder to see. Okay, but the bronze, it's polished and it catches the light. Okay. Next, I actually modified the safety. Okay, this is a Century build, and the Century builds fire from the rear position. Everybody else has theirs fire from the forward position. That's what I'm used to, so I modified it. I trimmed the safety internally, and then I drilled a hole here and put in a rivet and welded the back side. So now it can't return to that rear position. Because the Century's rifles actually have it has 3 positions. It has safe, nothing, and fire. And unless you're real comfortable with it and trained around it, I can find it misleading, and I get kind of hung up on that. So I just went ahead and took care of that for myself. Also, I built a extended magazine release, so you can hit it with your pointer finger or the opposite hand here. I also built the bolt release here. Okay, you press it down with your pointer finger, and you got to put some effort into it. It's probably a pound of pressure, maybe a pound and a half. That's sort of the nature of the rifle. Okay, and I also gave this a trigger upgrade. For a while, I had 2 trigger upgrades. One that was 1/4 of an inch, and one that was a little less than 1/8 of an inch. About 3/32 of an inch of travel. Okay, and this is versus the stock trigger on all these rifles has a 1/2 inch of travel. Okay, so I did a 1/4 inch job and I did a 3/32 job. Okay, I've gotten so good at the 3/32 that I just went ahead and eliminated the 1/4 inch job because it's not worth my time, and I can do better. Anyhow, the point is that this rifle actually has the 1/4 inch trigger job. And that's because I don't know, I never took the time to bring it up to date with all my other triggers on my other rifles. But let's go ahead and take a look at that. Alright, take it off safe. So normally the trigger travel is probably from about here to there. Okay, 1/2 inch. This one, it's got a 1/4 of an inch of travel. Okay, it goes to right there. Whereas there, the stock trigger goes all the way to the rear right there, from there to there. This one has just a 1/4 of an inch. And it actually breaks right about in the middle. Okay, and so there's a bit of a take-up. Well, there's take-up at the beginning, and there's a little of a follow-through at the end, and I've been told that's exactly what you want. All right? Listen, guys, thank you for watching, and let me know what you think. I really do appreciate the compliments and the comments. Take it easy.